Thanks for the introduction, Robin. I feel old when you talk about the past. The title of my presentation was actually given to me because it shouldn't look like the overall theme of this meeting, about past and present and future. But the title is a bit perhaps too assertive. It suggests that there perhaps is a canonical history of STS. So actually, you shouldn't say the history of STS. There are histories, and depends a little bit on where you are in the field. And part of my thinking about this is not because I was invited to give a talk about the history of STS, but because there is an ongoing project at the moment about documenting the history of STS. It's not archival, although that's part of it. It's also doing oral history by interviewing people. And actually, the Science Studies Unit anniversary volume has started with interviewing people about the development of STS. It's definitely timely. The 50th anniversaries are around, but also a number of important people in the field are retiring or have retired. So this is the time to actually ask them to tell about the history. I took the initiative together with Pierre Benoit Joly.
I hear you very well, Arie.
Sorry?
Can you use the mic, because we can't hear at the back, apparently.
Okay. And we have got support from a number of people, particularly from Mike Lynch at Cornell. The project is just starting up. There's no real money. But we hope to make some progress. One key part of the whole project is to scope how much we would include, because STS could be about everything. And we took the decision to go for the demography of the field, not the definition of the field in terms of its object or its approaches. We would get into endless struggles if we did so. On the other hand, we cannot avoid to say something about object and approaches. So I'll do a bit of that. And also I will offer you my reading of the field, of our field perhaps. And that starts already in the next slide. But then through my presentation, in the course of my presentation, it will become more personal, more my reading of the field and some of the things I've been involved in. And part of the readings of my own of the field have to do with my own history, how I moved into the whole field on the wings of the critical student movement, the late 1960s. And I was invited to do so. The way when Jane Calvert interviewed me for the Science Studies Unit book, I said it was a lateral move. I was into philosophy more than into STS, but then I discovered STS and I never returned to philosophy or chemistry. So our field, actually, there are two main currents, one which both can be abbreviated as STS. One stands for Science and Technology Studies. You can think of Edinburgh with Science Studies. You can think of Sussex with History, Philosophy and Social Studies of Science. It's a bit like an interdisciplinary study of an object. Could be science, could be cities, could be poverty. It did introduce already at the time the gaze of the other on science. And that, for some, seemed to undermine the status of science, particularly when the constructivist approaches in STS became important. The other mainstream in the field is science, technology and society movement. You can recognize part of my roots there. Also starts in the late 1960s, not just with the critical students movement as in Europe, but also in the United States with the protests against the Vietnam War. And the movement was in particularly focused on broadening science teaching, in general, broader and more critical education, and an overall change, a goal, changing science for society, for the people, to quote titles of journals at the time. And also in this whole picture we should add, I think, particularly on this occasion, science, technology, innovation policy studies as part of the whole complex of science, and now covered to some extent by the notion of governance of science and technology in society. Then if we look at the story, I did a visualization of a number of phases, and the whole thing of interest in science, technology and society started with the realization how they were constitutive elements in our society. And should look a bit more closely at the interbellum in the 1940s, but I won't do so today. Instead I go on to the 1960s, early cusp, I call it a cusp, in terminology that you also use in complexity theory. The Cold War context was the early phase. The journal Minerva actually was supported through some of the Cold War institutions in the United States. And the later part of that cusp was the critical movement. I mentioned Vietnam already, but also the intellectual melting pot, where Thomas Kuhn was, and his work was very important. I mean, more his work than he himself as a person, because he tried to distantiate himself from STS. I think he had some problems of conscience, well, let's call it conscience, when he was awarded the Bernal Prize, and he was in doubt whether actually to accept it, and he said that when he gave his speech at the time. New departments occurred, new journals and so on. You know all that, I suppose, although I can, if you...
Speak up a bit more. I'm afraid
I can. Sorry, I was lowering my arm, getting tired from speaking into the microphone. So, these things continue into the 1970s. International Council of Science Policy Studies is an interesting place to look at what was happening, also because they took the initiative to create the first handbook of science, technology and society, which is also a sign of institutionalization of the field, but at a very early stage. Important was that STS teaching started in the broader education of chemists and physicists and biologists. So there are demographic effects in the sense that people will be employed to do this teaching. And that helped to shape the field very much, definitely in Europe, and to some extent in the United States. And that what happened in the 1970s, there was some contention about directions to go, and that contention actually helped to articulate what the field could be about. Then, from the 1980s, you see clear professionalization and institutionalization, and labels like STS became sort of commonly understood. And that then happened in parallel with gradual mainstreaming of STS, and at the same time puzzles about what the core of STS could be. Maybe there isn't a real core, but clearly there are some strong streams which in the Netherlands we've called pragmatic constructivism, if you want a term. Mainstreaming, there are two ways that I'm talking about that. One is how STS approach is taken up in many domains, and I list a few. Maybe if it's completely mainstream, there is no core left. Or maybe there is no need for the core, because STS might have sort of influenced so many fields that there is no reason to have it there as a field in its own right. This is just a thought in passing. These domains actually can have a positive influence on STS. And I mentioned the focus on single case studies, which was very visible in the field. which is not always sufficient to come up with strong conclusions. There's renewed integration with STS, Science Technology Innovation Studies and Innovation Policy Studies. And I mentioned already here, and I'll come back to that, recontextualization of science in society. There's another mainstreaming as well. I mentioned pragmatic constructivism. You could say that the STS movement was still there, but it differentiated, became more academic, almost disappeared in some countries like Germany and France, although it reappeared also more recently. You can see, and that intrigues me in a number of ways, that establishments take up interactions and activities that were pushed at the time of the critical movement of the 1970s. Science and Society was a program with the European Commission in its framework program, and then they realized that it continued a sort of dichotomy and a contrast, so they rephrased it as Science in Society, and now it's called, in the present framework program, Science with and for Society, which creates a very curious acronym, SWAFS, like dog barking. But okay, we'll live with that. And interestingly, STS scholars are now invited to speak in establishment situations, expert groups, committees. I've been part of committees in Brussels and elsewhere. There is some mainstreaming, you could say. Times are changing to honor I think it's Bob Dylan who actually... No, it's not Bob Dylan. It was already an existing song when he made it popular. Anyway, I've been to meetings with colleagues of mine from the Science, Technology and Society movement in the Netherlands, where we were sitting listening to establishment people proposing the things that we had been, in a sense, fighting for in the 1970s. So you could say this mainstreaming is something to be glad about or be frustrated about, sort of thinking back and arguing that we said so already or we did so already. This is again a passing thought. I promised that I would talk about recontextualization of science in society. It can be embraced. And I mentioned enactors, scientists, and promoters of science. Society, obviously, is heterogeneous. It may embrace the promises that are coming up recently, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and so on, synthetic biology. It might contest them or go for alternatives. And one interesting alternative for our purposes of this association is the fact that user-based innovation and community-based innovation is getting more attention. There's participation, also in research, and I put here citizen science between quotes because it is itself quite sort of heterogeneous and has different motives. It could be just cheap labor for astronomers. Also, epistemic monopoly of science institutions is opened up, and according to some it's undermined. And I created a visualization which adds a number of layers of recontextualization, starting with the sort of establishment of research universities in the late 19th century and creation of ivory towers, you could say. And then in a number of phases there were layers added which recontextualize science in society, including new actors and new activities. I mentioned patient associations here, but also that consultancies and NGOs are starting to do science, particularly in areas like sustainability. There's technology assessment in various forms. There's outreach and public engagement, which is now becoming more interactive. So people talk about co-construction or co-creation of science. And there is, as I said, this sort of struggle about epistemic authority, including US Congress committees saying that science should not be too theoretical because that's speculative. So you shouldn't actually, as science, talk about climate change because that's pure speculation. I'm misquoting a little bit, but I can support the point that I'm making. There's also the whole movement of indigenous knowledge and the puzzles and struggles there. So why should we reconstruct a history if we know so much already about what happened? Well, one point I want to make is that the early history of the 70s and 80s by now tends to be forgotten. Well, it actually shaped the field as we know it now. And one feature that is almost forgotten is the struggle with the so-called Mertonians, the people who were educated either directly by Robert Merton in the United States or indirectly. And at least one person here has that experience. Also, international organizations saw that struggle, like the International Sociological Association, and particularly in its Research Committee 23. So that's part of what I try to reconstruct in the project, these things. There's also, in terms of the struggles, the story about David Edge, who was 4S president at the time, 1987, who saw that Jerry Gaston was proposed as candidate to succeed him as president of 4S, and he wanted to avoid that for a number of reasons. We could talk about persons and personalities, and he invited me to be counter-candidate, and that move was actually successful. And what I don't say on my slide, that the story continues, because when I was president, I realized that the whole struggle with the Mertonians wasn't very productive. And so Tom Guerin, who had been secretary of 4S, and I approached Harriet Zuckerman, the wife of Robert Merton, and asked her whether she would become candidate for the 4S presidency. And she said, after some hesitation, yes, I will do it. And she was voted in. And then we got into a situation where there was still struggle, but it was not as contentious as it had been for all sorts of reasons. There's also other kinds of activities. The Yearbook Sociology of the Sciences appeared and was typically a European thing and tried explicitly to create an alternative to the Mertonian approach, or the so-called Mertonian approach. East, in somewhat of a contrast to 4S, at least a contrast in style, was established more or less in that same period, at least at the end of the period. So there's all sorts of reasons to go back to that earlier period. And this is a picture you may not be able to see very well, but what I try to visualize here is a movement from a sort of global view of science, let's call it that, the Mertonian view, so-called Mertonian, which then becomes much more regional, because paradigms and their incommensurability have their own sort of scope and authority, and that then moves on to a recognizable set of specialty studies in the 1970s, and it moves on further down to the laboratory studies, which started to be done at the end of the 70s already, but then became very visible in the 1980s, and it, to some extent, created the sort of style of the field of STS. This is, to some extent, an historical document, because I actually drew it up in 1990. So the references are to people whom you may not know anymore. They haven't all been forgotten, but the work of Richard Whitley, for example, was very important at the time. And he, in his an analysis of scientific disciplines as reputational organizations, and he did a number of other things, but his present interest in varieties of capitalism and also varieties of national systems of science and research has sort of overtaken his earlier work. And so he's not so visible anymore. So that's one element in my earlier point about the need to reconstruct that earlier history. So the references are dated, you could say, and the thinking, which is visualized here, is somewhat dated because it shows arrows going up again, and those arrows are now have their net effect already. One thing which isn't in this visualization is the overall changes in science and in the real world, outside science, you could say, and that there is this challenge how to diagnose these changes, which has become more visible with attempts of various people to actually create a diagnosis. Not, one very visible thing at the time in the 90s was the new modes of knowledge production, the first book, but definitely also the second book where Helga was, Novotny was very important in looking at how the world and society and science were changed at more or less the same time. And in that book, recontextualization is one of the key concepts also. So a net effect that I want to draw your attention to is that actually there is an implicit overall theory or an overall perspective that STS has created over the years. Not because one or another person was doing that, but because that's how the field developed. And that's why I wanted to show you this visualization. It's a dynamic approach. It thinks of multi-level developments as dynamic. It's spoiled over into technology studies. And there is the famous meeting in Twente, organized by Wiebe Wijker and Tom Hughes and Trevor Pinch, with the bus book, it's called sometimes, because there is a yellow cover with a school bus on it. And in general, you could say long-term developments and patterns in these long-term developments have become more interesting. So compared with the visualization that I had just now, the local is no longer what it used to be, that there would be exclusive focus on the local. And you can also see that part of these attempts at diagnosis lead to a renewed interest in anticipation. And you can see these things in the mixture of, say, policy-oriented foresight and more general foresight issues in which STS is involved. Also in the whole notion of anticipatory governance that people centered in Arizona State University have come up with. So, in showing you this, I want to highlight a few things which actually are related to my own involvement in these recent developments. So I've become a bit more personal or intellectual confessions, giving intellectual confessions. I'm intrigued by the future of institutions of science because they're changing now, and they're changing in context, of course. This long-term historical development, which I mentioned, I'll come back to in a minute, are about modernity, up to notions that we've never been modern, really modern, and reflexive modernization with Ulrich Beck and others as doing interesting work there. And one example that I talk about briefly is what I call a constellation of protected spaces. But I'll first show you my sort of take on the longer term history. There are quite a number of details in this picture, but I start with the 16th and 17th century, where I mentioned high science in academy, and then I show that there is a sort of ongoing low science trajectory, including experience-based knowledge and natural history, but also elements of professionalization, including the advent of real experimental approaches in laboratories, which comes into its own in the 19th century. And then you see the advent of research universities, and which runs against limits in the sense that they cannot continue as they are. So I'm adding to this timeline the notion that there would be sort of evolving social contracts the one from in the late 17th century with the Royal Society and Académie des Sciences in France. Science will be neutral and will therefore be protected by kings and princes. The second social contract, professionalized, specialized science as an integral part of the new bourgeois industrial society. And then a third situation where there might be a new social contract, but it's not quite clear how that will come about. So that's why I find recontextualization an important notion, even if it's not fully stabilized as a new social contract. And I use a way of analysis in which I try to continue looking at the local, but also include higher level institutionalizations. So you would have modes of knowledge production, ongoing socio-technical practices, also outcomes of these new modes of knowledge production. And then at a sort of higher level, this happens in various institutions, which themselves evolve. Just think of how research funding agencies are moving with the times. And there are then, at an even higher level, what you could call overarching orders of society, sort of de facto constitution, which includes these social contracts, which I mentioned in my previous slide. And an implication of looking at all this in this way is that if these three levels are aligned, there is no escape. There is escape in the sense it's not easy to change them because they're all aligned together. And we are at the moment in a situation where actually there are openings at the various levels, so there are openings for change, and actors can become important in trying for those changes. And maybe we'll hear about that from other people today. I talk about, and I've written about it in terms of analysis of nested spaces, partially nested, micro-protected spaces in a laboratory or in conditioned field studies which are controlled, meso-protected spaces, disciplines, funding agencies are doing the protection there, and macro-protected spaces, which is like the social contract, the mandate given to science in our society. And I mentioned strategic science here, but I'm not going into details. And my point here about opening of things is saying keep some heterogeneity. Postpone a lock-in that I indicated as a possibility, and in a sense learn to live in partially unprotected spaces. And that's a message to scientists, you could say. So I add some further recent developments. I referred already to research funding agencies and that they are changing under credibility pressures. It's not always their own initiative. And one indicator is how they embrace, at least in some countries, the fashionable move towards responsible research and innovation. Again, I could go into that if you want me to in discussion. Another example is this also fashionable interest in so-called grand challenges. And then the challenge that Stefan Kuhlmann and I have been analyzing is how to actually work on them. Not just having the rhetorics of grand challenges, but also do something serious about it, because you cannot take up the earlier experience with mission-oriented programs for science. Those were different. This is not about getting a man on the moon and checking whether he actually got there, which is itself a contentious thing with some groups in the United States. But that's another story. I should have had animated this, but I forgot clearly. Another sort of new development is this bridging of STS and innovation studies. It's continuing the tradition which is visible with some people in STS. David Edge was an example that, and Robin mentioned him already as somebody who did lots of bridging. And that's one example of how bridging can be linked to individuals and their positions. I was comparing this with what a few people in 4S, at 4S meetings tried to do in the 80s with people like Ron Johnston, first in Manchester, then in Australia, Wollongong and so on, but also Susan Cousins and John Simon and myself. But that wasn't very successful, although we were able to create a big NATO-funded study institute, as it was called, in 1989, which the people who were there still remember. Helga was there, and she still remembers, I suppose. It was in a lovely location, but we could go into the sort of anecdotal part of it. But it did show that it was possible to get these various people together who were interested in science in society and were willing to do some substantial analysis and draw conclusions. By now, I think this is a general move. It's not like 1989 anymore. And UK Assist is a clear example. Another example, but ad hoc, was a workshop in St. Petersburg, which actually was organized by a guy from University of California at Davis, Mario Biagioli, but with his own sort of history of analyzing 17th century science, myself, and then support from my colleague Harro van Lente and of Robin Williams. My own involvement is still there, and I just very briefly mentioned a few items which would, as it will be, examples of crossbreeding of STS and innovation studies by introducing some of the complexity that STS is good at, and perhaps also some reduction of complexity in which STS is perhaps not so good. I mentioned the analysis of innovation journeys, but extended from the original conception introduced by Andrew van der Ven by including more parts of the journey, including embedding in society. Jan Schott and I have been working on that at an early stage, and I continue working on it. Also, patterns in innovation at a higher level, where Pierre-Bernard Joly and Michel Collomb and I worked on the difference between the regime of economics of techno-scientific promising, which are very visible in some of the policy documents, and the regime of collective experimentation, like in agriculture or with patients in the health sector, which is, but also in the sports sector, which is much less visible. Also, what I've been involved in, together with Jan Schott again, in a sort of multi-layer model of technological innovation and its embedding in society. And I call it multi-layer to get away from the terminology that's now common in transition analysis, where Frank Geels has introduced the high multi-level model, or not just his introduction, but people who are quoting that approach. I tend to talk about multi-level model of technological innovation and transitions, which is a bit too strong a word, I would say. Possibility for further crossbreeding, that's my final slide, as it were to set the tone for further discussions today. The importance of the role of anticipation, where there is from the business side strategy development in practice, a new interest in that, and at the STS side the sociology of expectations. There is interest in spaces and effects of spaces, both at the STS side and at innovation studies side. New programs in the European Union, framework programs from the early 80s were creating new spaces. There are hybrid consortia, also in relation to grand challenges. And there's also the very concrete spaces like garages, in which some of the innovations in Silicon Valley started. The kitchens, in which do-it-yourself synthetic biology can grow, and you can have competitions about it. The fab labs, which are becoming popular for 3D printing. There's lots of spaces around where things happen, not in a very strict way. It's not predictable what will happen there, but that again, that actually is the important part of the role of spaces. And then finally, the whole notion of research and innovation systems, which is a policy fashion again, in not all countries, but many countries. It's often called national research and innovation systems. I've been adding knowledge to it to get away from the focus on institutionalized research. It's co-evolving with socio-political context, and the evolution is looked at a bit, and there's more history of these research and innovation systems. What I've been interested in is, if you think of it as co-evolving, you might also think what could be growth points in such research and innovation systems. And that is particularly important for developing countries who are in a sort of dependency relationship to the northern world, you could say. So there are possibilities for further crossbreeding, and they are linked up to the achievements of STS field, but also changes in innovation studies themselves. So there is really a great future for the UK Association for Studies of Science, Technology, Innovation, Science and Technology, and not just for the association, for the two fields, STS and innovation studies. Thank you.